You're listening to the Small and Supercharged podcast with Ria Freeman, episode 160. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you about something really exciting that the British Equestrian Trade Association, also known as BETA to its friends, is doing. I'm lucky enough to work with BETA, and I've been involved with the Summer of Safety campaign, and it's going to be awesome. Whether you're a member of the trade or you're just a passionate equestrian, there's loads in store for you over the next few months. Lots of lives, amazing content around keeping you and your horse safe, equestrian celebrities and skills that could quite literally save someone's life. And there's also a huge amount of competitions and prizes that are running through the Summer of Safety too. I don't know how much the prize pool's worth, but it is a significant amount of money. To find out more, you need to hop over to beta-uk.org and also make sure you're following their Facebook page and make sure you are following them on Instagram too, and you'll get loads and loads of content through there. As Dr Di, who is one of our guests today, is the CMO of BETA, it seemed fitting to mention it, and honestly, I'm really excited about it. I hope you love it too. On today's podcast, we haven't just got one amazing person, we have got two amazing people. We have got Issy Carlill, who you might know better as Zigzag Eventing, and we've also got Dr Di, or Di Fisher, or All the King's Horses, or Chief Medical Officer of BETA. So we're doing well today. I'm excited to bring this one to you, and you will understand why we've got so many people on shortly. But Issy emailed me with a brilliant email and about what's been going on for her and a story that she's really, really keen to share. And to be honest, I think anytime we can share really good stories, do good, help to educate people and potentially help to make their lives better, I'm all in for that. So Issy, thank you so much for your email to start with. And can you tell us a bit about you and a bit about why you reached out?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ria, first of all. I'm really excited to be here. And I reached out because I've had quite the past few months, I guess, past year really, which has seen me go through a lot of different challenges. Most recently, both of my horses were involved in quite a significant road traffic accident. And actually very fortunate to still be alive and be with us, which saw both of them sustain pretty significant injuries, and one spent just under a month in Lip Hook Equine Hospital on cross ties. So that was a big challenge that I had to overcome, and that was one of the toughest things I've been through. And then equally, the couple of days after the accident, I was diagnosed with a mild traumatic brain injury and persistent concussion syndrome as well, which were the result of a fall that I'd actually had roughly 2 years earlier, and I'd had a lot of symptoms of, but never really realised what it was until I finally sought medical advice and got the diagnosis. So two quite significant things that happened in a very short space of time. And I really just reached out to you to sort of say I wanted to share my story, and one, how to face significant challenges and how to overcome them and how to remain strong during really difficult times, but also most importantly to share my story of my fall and the subsequent diagnosis that I've had, because I just think us horse riders aren't really always aware of symptoms of things like concussion and actually how significantly it can affect your life. So I reached out to you because I really want to share that story. It's very important to me that we talk about these things.
Oh, definitely. And I think that obviously we have got Di here, and I know that
I absolutely love you for that. Don't I love you for that. I'm doing the hearts on the Zoom. Love you.
I was thinking, as those words left Issy's mouth, I thought, yeah, I've heard this before, because or not only do we not recognise the symptoms, we don't take our injuries seriously. And if we did recognise them, we wouldn't do anything about it anyway, a lot of the time.
Are you actually telling me it took you 2 years to go to a doctor? Because
yeah, it did.
Actually won the ribbon for the biggest interval accident doctor, like 2 years.
Oh, it's awful. I mean, I remember it really well, actually. So I had 2 falls in a week, and at both times I fell off backwards and hit the base of my skull and my neck. First one, I was sort of fine. I was schooling, jumped back up, got back on, finished. And the second one was actually a competition. It was in the show jump warm up at a BE event. And again, I came off backwards, jumped back up. I had to see the doctor because you're required to at BE events now. And she looked at me and she sort of, did a couple of tests and was like, "You're fine." So I went and caught my horse and got back on and finished the day. I did my show jumping, I did my cross country, and then it wasn't actually until I stopped and I sat down at the end of the day and the adrenaline went, that I suddenly thought, oh, I've got a really bad headache and my neck is really hurting. And then I was trying to eat and I thought, oh, I feel really, really sick. And my partner just said, I think you should probably go to the ambulance and have the doctors look at you again. So I did. And they said, you definitely have a concussion. They called the doctor who came to look at me as well. I had a 3-week suspension put on my BE membership as well. So I couldn't enter anything, which I think is brilliant. You know, before that, I would say 3 weeks is quite a long time, but you know what, having known and realized how much a concussion can affect you, I think 3 weeks almost isn't enough actually. So yes, I had the suspension put on. I went home and they told me to rest, and I was out for a good 3 or 4 days, you know, lying in a dark room. Like, it felt like I'd been hit by a bus. The worst sort of, like a worst hangover you could ever have. It was horrible.
Wow.
And then got better and you know, cracked on as the typical horse rider does, and just didn't realize for the longest time how unwell I was and how well my body had adjusted to being so poorly.
So what kind of things had you noticed? I mean, first of all, I think obviously it's brilliant that they have such great facilities on site at these BE events, and well done you for going back. I'm sure that Di would agree with that as well.
Yeah, 100%.
But then what kind of happened that made you think this isn't quite right?
So I've not been very well for probably, well, a significant period of time. Before the accident as much as after the accident, I've had a lot of underlying health issues. And I was diagnosed with ME and CFS last year, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. And I sort of, there's not much treatment for that, I suppose. So I've learned to manage it, but there was still a lot of symptoms that I was getting, like vertigo, nausea, dizziness, really serious dizziness, and awful headaches and neck pain as well. And it was actually, my mum saw Harry Mead had a bad fall last year, and she saw on his page that he'd posted about this rehabilitation specialist he was seeing that called Hobbs, and they're based in the southeast, which is where I am. And she told me to reach out to them because she felt that a lot of my symptoms overlapped with everything that they treat, the MTBI, which is the mild traumatic brain injury, and the persistent concussion syndrome. So I sent them an email and they said, you're definitely a candidate. And I then went and had an appointment with them, and they ran a good few tests. Quite amazing to see how much my visual system has changed, and my vestibular system, which is my ears and all the buttons. And then it turned out that yes, I had the PCS and I had the MTBI, and that was it really. Yeah, it was thank God for my mum. She was smart enough to realize that there was something else there, because apparently it can be quite common for these things to be if you've got other health issues, they can not be misdiagnosed, but perhaps not recognized as quickly as usual, because the symptoms overlap with a lot of other illnesses that you can have. So yeah.
Crikey. And when you kind of got that diagnosis, how did that make you, I mean, also, how did it make you feel? But obviously at that time you've just had 2 horses that have also had a serious accident. So that's quite a week.
Yeah, I slightly felt like, why me at the time? I'll be honest, it was a bit like, oh my gosh, what else needs to be added to the list of things I'm going through right now? But actually, equally, I felt quite positive about it, because they're brilliant. The team that I work with are fantastic. They are so knowledgeable and really supportive. And they were very realistic as well. You know, they said it's been a significant amount of time since the accident and all the symptoms that you've had, so it's going to take a long time to effectively retrain my visual and vestibular system and do all that work. But you know, they were really positive, and actually I felt quite good about it, because it finally felt like I had an answer for all these symptoms I've been having. And I'll admit, it wasn't really until I started talking to them at the first appointment that I realized how unwell I'd truly been for so long, and I just learned to compensate. And it is amazing. The body is very good at finding ways to compensate, and you don't even realize it. And yeah, it was eye-opening, but a hugely positive experience for me.
So I feel we should hand over to Di now. Can you tell us what these things are? What is, and how do we get them? Like, how do we want them? But I think how we can relate it to our normal lives, because sometimes we hear these terms and we think, it never happened to me, but that's not the case at all, is it?
No, not at all. And obviously, firstly, Issy, like, you know, I'm really sorry that that's happened to you, because it's a really, you're rare, you know, because concussion is incredibly common, as we know, and it's a term that non-medics bandy around a lot. Oh, I've got a touch of concussion, or we quite often decide ourselves that we've got a touch of concussion and we haven't even been to see anyone. So for you to suffer, really, which is what I imagine you have done for that period of time, I'm just really glad that you managed to reach out and get in contact with the experts. Obviously, there's a lot of work and a lot of stuff highlighted around head injury and concussion, and a lot of research has been ongoing, mainly coming out of NFL and coming from America, a lot of it, sort of looking around actually what is concussion really, because it always used to be the sort of diagnosis of, okay, you've had a nasty head injury, but you didn't fit this criteria, so you didn't need scanning. So if you had a bit of a headache and you felt a bit sick, that was to be expected. So it's a mild head injury, off you go home. And I think there was a lack of understanding, and a lack of understanding around the mechanism of how the injury occurs, to understand how that could affect somebody going forward. So I think it's probably quite important to understand how it happens. So you don't have to. I think probably one of the most surprising things is you don't actually have to have a head injury to get concussion. So any significant fall where you get extreme either rotation or flexion or extension, so if your head bends or whips in any way, you can still do damage to the brain even though you haven't actually hit your head. So it's incredibly important that anybody that has an injury has a full check of everything, because they might come in saying, well, I fell off my horse and I don't know, I fell directly onto my bum and everything got shaken, but I feel a bit this and I feel a bit that. You know, they have to be screened for head injury as well. So the brain is kind of suspended in a fluid, so it floats within the skull. And the skull itself is obviously very, very rigid, and there's nowhere for it to go. So when we have either a direct blow, or if we have a significant injury elsewhere or mechanism, the brain shakes, you know, and violently shakes. And the brain's made up of neurons. You might remember it from school when you saw the kind of like, it looks a bit like a sort of weird tadpole where it's got the long axis of the neuron and then the neuronal cell. And they communicate really closely with their neighboring cells. But the action of them being flung around means that they can tear. So they can tear, they can stretch. And then what happens is within the cells, there's very tight regulation of all of the ions and things that are there. So you've got potassium and sodium and glucose and all sorts of things that live in there that make it work. And because they get stretched and torn, their cell membranes become a bit leaky. And so you get a change in the concentration of the things that should be there. They become unregulated. And because of that, they can affect the amount of blood flow coming into the brain. Now, the brain feeds exclusively off glucose. So it doesn't, you know, come off any other energy apart from glucose. So if you have a cell that's injured, not only is it, say, I don't know, spitting out a load of potassium because it's just its membrane's been stretched and the transport is not working very well, it then affects its mate, because they're literally hugged together in the brain, aren't they? Which then affects its mate, because that one then starts spitting something out. So you just end up with this brain that's in an incredibly vulnerable position. And that sort of, at the same time, because it's injured, it needs to repair. So it needs energy to repair. So it needs blood flow, and it needs more blood flow than you would normally use in a resting state. So you end up where you get this big mismatch of sort of neurochemical stuff and the energy that's required to get you better. Now, we know that if you have one knock, that can be bad enough to cause concussion. And I think it's important to understand that, you know, obviously concussion doesn't show on an MRI or on a CT. So you don't see this because this is cellular damage that happens, and it can be quite, if it's a direct blow, obviously the brain flies from one side of the skull to the other. So you get the contracture injury that I've talked about before, where you get the bit where it's whacked your head and then the brain's shot over the other side and it kind of ricochets. So you get you can get focus of sort of bruising and stuff within the brain. But if you get a sort of general shake, you can get all over that they've all had a really good shaking. Now, the fogginess and things that people feel, and the inability to kind of think straight and all of that, that's directly down to, or the feeling is currently that is directly down to the fact that these neurochemicals are not quite right. And then on top of that, there's not quite enough blood supply going in, because it needs more energy and it can't get it, because the neurochemicals are making the arteries and things go, well, no, we're gonna actually tighten up a little bit, because that's what we do when we get this substance around us. So you just end up in this really, really bad place. And then on top of that, obviously, microscopically and on a cellular level, as you've had to see with your vestibular system, you can actually get structural damage as well.
Crikey.
So it is a big deal, to be honest. There was, I think it was sort of like the late or mid 80s, there was a paper that was written about a sort of second impact syndrome. So there's a very, very, very rare, so it is very, very rare condition where if you've got the whole brain that's incredibly vulnerable, if it gets a second knock, that somebody can develop cerebral edema, so swelling within the brain that causes the brain to herniate through the hole and kill you, like within a couple of minutes of the second impact.
Jesus.
It's incredibly rare, but we do know that your brain is so vulnerable, which is why you got that 3-week ban.
Yeah.
I am so pleased to hear that. I mean, I know that BE do that anyway, but I am so pleased to hear that they did that and actually made it impossible for you to get around it, because we're buggers. We'll be like, oh yeah, be all right though. I'll just go and do that one. They won't know. But the fact that they've actually stopped you on the site from being able to, do you know what I mean? Book
Yeah.
That's just really reassuring. So it's not a simple just you've got a bit of a knocked head. And then obviously the other thing that's been in the news a lot, shouldn't be as bad with horse riders, depending on how often you're falling off, but obviously there's a big link with dementia. For when you look at the boxers, and there's been all that work around them looking a bit punch drunk and getting repeated concussions, and that causing structural damage and leading to a sort of encephalopathy type thing that there is. So yeah, it's not a serious injury. It is a traumatic brain injury. It's just you can't see it on a CT or an MRI. And I think although that's reassuring in the instance that you think, okay, well, look, you haven't had a big bleed, you haven't got a subdural hematoma, you haven't got all these nasty things. I don't know. I don't think people are aware enough, hence the 2-year not aware enough. We expect to feel a bit crappy when we've knocked our heads. And I think anything that can be done to sort of increase the awareness, or increase obviously people wearing the helmets, etc., but you had one on, that, you know, it's not a minor injury at all. It's a traumatic brain injury.
And I just from my personal perspective, I was so unaware of what all the symptoms were, and I knew the word concussion, and doctors used it on the day, but I didn't really know what that meant. You think of concussion as quite a short-term thing. It affects you and then you kind of crack on again, and that's what I did. And I had no idea that actually it can continue to affect you. And I just think we need to be more aware of that, because we are in a sport where you're going to fall off and hit your head, and like you said, actually sometimes you don't even need to hit your head to have a concussion. And I just wish I'd known sooner what all the symptoms were and actually what I was experiencing, rather than thinking, oh, it's just ill health and I get extreme dizziness and nausea and all this visual disturbance. And I just kind of put that down to just being unwell. I had no idea where it had come from. And like you said, I would have probably gone and seen someone much quicker than 2 years later if I'd known.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because like you say, with you're slightly more complicated in the fact that with your ME and your CFS, that there is an overlap of symptoms, and so therefore, because I think if you maybe hadn't had ME and chronic fatigue, then I think you maybe would have thought, oh, more quickly, this is not right. This is not right.
Yeah.
And if you've got the sort of mild symptoms of concussion, so a headache that's relieved by paracetamol, bit nauseous but not being sick, all the things that are okay, then you know you're going to expect that to have symptoms of concussion for, you know, a couple of days, couple of weeks. But after a couple of weeks, if it's not going away, obviously nice clinical advice would be at that point to either see your GP, well, see your GP really, who would refer you in to look at maybe imaging or further investigation to see why things aren't quite, you know, quite right at that point. But, you know, it's a very vulnerable thing, the brain. And I always think of it as a bit like a jelly on a plate. Like, you know, it does, you know, if you shake it, it shakes. So,
yeah,
you know, and it's banging against a rigid, spiky wall. I don't know if you saw I did a reel once and I showed the base, inside of the base of the skull. It's so sharp. Like if you even touch it, it feels like it's going to prick your finger.
In my head, inside the skull was smooth. Like where the brain is housed was nice and smooth inside. But as you say, I didn't, when you said about being
top bit here, so the top half of your head where you put your hat, this bit here, yes. But if you look into the vault, into the base of the skull, they are super sharp. Super sharp. Like if you put I've got my skeleton somewhere, but obviously people can't see because it's a podcast. If you poke them, they blink and hurt your fingers. You've got really delicate tissue around that. Really delicate tissue.
So when you were you first diagnosed with concussion at the event?
Yeah, so they said at the event after I'd fallen off and the second time I went back that I had a concussion. And they just said it was very mild at that point, and she said, you know, go home and rest. And I still remember her looking at me and she said, and you must rest. And I kind of went, yeah, okay. And actually, to be fair, when I woke up the next day, I really didn't have a choice because I felt really unwell. But it just goes to show how us horse riders are sort of notorious for not heeding medical advice.
I think it's an understanding about what brain rest is as well. I think, you know, obviously you had such a knock that you had no choice but to actually lie in your darkened room and not. Like a lot of people will then be like, okay, well, I can't ride the horse, but or you'll sit on your phone. Now, obviously, anything you do with your brain, even thinking, requires energy because it's a cell that needs fuel. And we've already sort of explained that you've got this energy mismatch. And any energy that your brain's getting, you want it to use it to repair the cells. So if you then are looking at your phone in bed, for example, actually, that's like your brain running a little marathon. So it's going to take even longer. So complete rest is complete rest. Absolutely, as you did, you know, zero phone, zero TV, zero stimulus to the brain. You almost want it to be sleeping, which is incredibly difficult to do if you're not feeling as bad as you were at that point. That's very difficult to do, to just lie there, isn't it?
Yeah, because I didn't really have a choice. I couldn't even look at a phone or a computer screen. I literally laid in a darkened room. But a girl at the yard actually fell off recently and had a bit of concussion. And I remember saying to her, you must go and lie down and don't look at your phone and don't look at your computer at all, because it's really, really bad for you. But she felt fine. She was sort of you know, a headache and things like that. But other than that, she was functioning. So it is, especially in this day and age, you just sit on your phone or your laptop, don't you? And it's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, not ideal. Not
so
ideal.
in terms of, so you had your, sorry, just looking at the notes again, mild traumatic brain injury, which is obviously the injury you had when you fell off, and then the persistent concussion syndrome. Is that just basically the symptoms of concussion for a flipping long time? Is that what it is in simple terms?
From my understanding, yes. I think Di will probably be able to give a better sort of debrief of what it means. But from what the experts told me that I'm working with, yeah, it's basically persistent concussion symptoms.
Yeah, so Izzy's right. You know, it's she's got a good handle on what's wrong with her, but it's those worrying and really can be incapacitating, I would think, at times, like really difficult symptoms like the dizziness, like the sort of brain fog. I don't know if you've experienced any change in your mood as well, because that can be, especially because obviously if you think the frontal lobe, if you've given that a bit of it, like you hit the back of your head twice, so you will have hit the front of your head as hard inside your skull because you whacked here, so your brain shot forward and hit the front. Now your frontal lobe is your personality and everything else. So it wouldn't surprise me, you don't need to disclose, but it wouldn't surprise me in that scenario if somebody had really struggled with low mood, etc. Having problems with balance, really common after.
My balance is really terrible.
But,
Working on it now, obviously.
Yeah, and you can, now you're in the right. Now you are in touch with the right people. There is rehabilitation, so you can retrain the brain, but there's no guarantees with anything, but you can do everything you can to, and like you said, it's improving. You can improve your balance and improve sort of coping with the symptoms, but it's a pretty nasty thing to have going forward.
It's amazing how it affects your mood, because that was another thing that I remember when they asked me the questions, and I sort of thought, I guess I get quite irritable and I can get quite low mood. I don't mind talking about it. I'm very open, but it wasn't something that I'd really thought of as ever being linked to anything like a concussion. But I just thought it was me being kind of an unreasonable person, to be honest.
And it's irritability that's really common.
Yeah.
It's about someone that's normally quite chilled being a bit aggy about stuff and probably being a bit unreasonable.
Yes, yeah. And I just would find that sometimes it's almost like you're not able to rationalize. It's really strange.
Yeah.
But also that kind of thing, if you don't know why it's happening, I imagine can make you feel, especially with everything you had going on, because you say you got diagnosed with this just after your horses had a horrible accident, which would make anybody feel horrific and low and everything else. But if you have that on the top, that must have been really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and it's times of high stress as well that I find make the symptoms much more significant, and especially when I don't have enough sleep. Sleep is the crucial thing for me, and as soon as I lose that, whether it be quality or sort of quantity of sleep, then the symptoms just become really significant and really, really noticeable. And I didn't realize actually until I started learning how to cope with this and how to get better, that sleep is like essential to your brain's recovery.
So how long can people have persistent concussion syndrome for? Because I'm like Issy, I thought you got concussion, it lasted for a few days, worst case a few weeks, and then you were sorted again.
Well, it's a bit like how long is a piece of string, to be honest. And there's always a spectrum with any disease. There's or not disease, but it's a disease process, I guess. That there's a spectrum of people. So you'll have someone that, like Issy, you'll have to say like somebody that maybe has a bit of concussion for 48 hours, somebody that then has one for a couple of weeks, somebody that has one for a couple of months, couple of years, as Issy is at the moment. And then obviously at the end of that spectrum, there is going to be somebody that is going to be the person that long-term has continuing issues. It's very difficult to predict who that's going to be, but it's about looking at that person as a whole. So it's about obviously doing all the rehab and everything that you're doing, which sounds fab, to be honest, and that's not available everywhere. So if you're not sort of they're based southeast, aren't they? If you're not sort of down there,
they are near Guildford.
Okay, so there are some charities that you can go to. So there's a big charity that does a lot of work called Headway, who is really good and can put people in touch with people, but they have quite a good website, to be honest, for explanation and also for contact and a lot of support. Because if you've been cranky for a couple of years and you didn't know why and stuff, some people can end up, obviously again not saying this is you, can end up where it's been quite disruptive in their lives, and it's affected relationships, close relationships as well. So it can be quite difficult for somebody. So the rehab process is not just making sure your balance gets better, it's about coping with something long term and adjusting. I mean, I think you've done amazingly well, because most of this you've actually done yourself. So it's a testament to how strong and how resourceful you've been yourself. But obviously not everybody is as strong as you, so they do need to sort of come to us, and then we can put them in touch with the right people.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it takes someone else saying to you, have you thought about actually going to see someone? Because if my mum hadn't really flagged it with me, and if she hadn't read about Harry Mead's experience and the fact that he was working with these people, and then she went and looked further and sort of felt it ticked a lot of boxes for me, I never would have reached out to anyone.
Yeah.
and because she came to me and said, I think this is you. And then when I read on their website, they have lots of information, and I read through it all and I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, this is me. That was what encouraged me to take that first step. So, you know, actually equally, it's just as important if you know someone who you think it might relate to, it is well worth, you know, reaching out to them about it.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. Very, very difficult. But there is help. And how are you, what rehab are you doing now then? What are you?
So a lot of it is retraining my visual and vestibular system, because what's happened is the crystals in my ears have been knocked, and I'm basically 100% dependent on my eyesight for all my balance and everything. So as soon as I do an exercise with my eyes closed, I can't do it. I just physically cannot do it because my brain is going, where am I?
Wow.
So we're trying to retrain the system so that actually my ears will begin to do their job again.
Because we don't think of our ears being involved in balance. I mean, I know you do if you've got a problem, but generally you don't, do you?
No, you think it's all just done on your eyesight, and it's amazing. It's actually mostly done off your ears.
Done off your ears. I've got to admit, I do think that, but that's only because I went to med school.
I'm not being funny. This is like not your first rodeo, is it? This is not the first time you've been doing this kind of thing. It's mine.
It's no, because the ears, that's what, I mean, there's two systems in there. There's the auditory stuff, so the stuff where you're hearing, and then there's the vestibular stuff. And Izzy's right, you've got these little things called otoliths, and they're little crystals that just float in this like slime, and then there's these little hairs that stick up that are called neurocilia. I think I'm dragging this from the bottom of my mind, but they kind of get, depending on how the crystals move, depends on how they get stimulated. So then your brain knows where you are in time and space, because otherwise it's almost like you've got no gravity in a way, because your brain can't work out where it is. So you'd look a bit like Terminator, like I'm doing now, but do you know what I mean? It doesn't know where it is in time and space, so there's no balance at all. Like you would straight away.
I remember the first session I went to with them, and they had me walk in a straight line with my eyes open, fine, and then she said shut your eyes, and I felt like I was walking straight, but I had gone completely off track and was like all the way across the other end of the room. But I felt like I was walking normally. It was so bizarre to feel.
Are you worse one side than the other?
I'm a bit worse on the right side. The balance is a bit more difficult, especially if I'm doing something like a single leg exercise. That's where I struggle more, and it's quite noticeable. And
I know, because obviously I follow you on Instagram, you're back riding. How are you find it? What sort of effect are you finding with your riding?
The one thing I find sometimes is if I'm doing something that is quick and sudden movements, like jumping, I sometimes get this sort of visual disturbance, and it's like the whole world kind of spins around me, and it's very quick. It lasts a couple of seconds, but it's pretty significant, and every so often I do get that, and I think I find things like lighting affects it, and again, I don't find it so much in the flat work or when I'm hacking, but if I'm doing something like jumping and I'm moving from walk to canter quite fast, or I'm turning my head quite quickly, I just suddenly get that split second where I'm like, oh, I feel really dizzy, and then it goes and I'm fine again.
You got a neck strap?
I don't. Should I have one?
Please have one, yeah, just in case, that's all.
So
obviously, but I know you wear a hat, so
I always wear a hat.
Like, maybe a neck strap's a good idea, to be fair, just in case it doesn't come back.
I'm a martingale, but I should probably have a proper official neck strap.
I'd whack a neck strap on for that, or a balance. I wouldn't. Well, either that or a balance strap, isn't it? But I'd just whack a neck strap on.
Something easy to grab.
So obviously, I know this isn't a medical podcast, so if you're listening to this and you feel poorly, Di's going to tell you what to do, which I imagine is go and see somebody. But how do we, as riders, then deal with concussion, and what do we do, and what information can we take from everything we've learnt here that people can go off and they can use, and it can make an actual difference to them? Who do they need to go to? What they need to do?
So it all depends on what happened. Okay, so if you've had a bang to your head, and you've been knocked out and you've just woken up, you 100% need to go to A&E. If you are vomiting, it's okay to feel a bit sick, but if you're actually vomiting, you need to go to A&E. If you've got a headache that just will not go away despite taking painkillers, so paracetamol or ibuprofen, but I cannot stress strongly enough, no aspirin. Now, there's not many people in the younger age groups that use aspirin, but in the older age groups and people with migraine commonly use aspirin. You must not use aspirin if you've had a head injury, because it can affect your ability to clot. So it can make you more bleedy. So no aspirin.
Okay.
So if it doesn't go away with that, if somebody says to you, you're not quite, it's normally the change in behavior, people and being irritable is normally somebody with you that notices that you're not quite yourself. Obviously, if you've had any booze, because people fall over when they've had booze, me, or if you've, which I'm sure nobody does, but if you've taken any recreational drugs in any way, shape or form, we'd need to see you, because it can again affect your likelihood of injury. If you have any blood clotting disorders, so if you're haemophiliac, or if you're taking any blood thinners, so warfarin, clopidogrel, any of the DOACs, if you're on these things, you will know you're on them. We need to see you because you need to be scanned every time you have a head injury. And if you've had previous brain surgery, so we would need to see you. So it's a bit of a long list, but the main thing is if you've got a headache that will not go away, if you're vomiting like mad, if you can't see properly, and you really, really feel unwell, and you need to come and see us. Now, if you've had a bit of a knock, but actually you definitely didn't knock yourself out, you feel a bit nauseous and a bit stunned, but you're okay. You know, you've obviously not, I mean, obviously if somebody has a fit, they're going to go anyway. I mean, that's without saying, isn't it? That, you know, but you're actually okay, like you were saying about your friends, okay, that's fine, you know, then you can kind of sit on it. But I think if there's any concern, go and get checked, would be my advice.
And it doesn't have to be at that moment either, does it? You might have the fall, feel okay-ish, but then a few hours later.
Yeah, and that's quite common, because some people will have the bang to the head, and then, as we talked about before, you get this kind of change in the brain substance because of it, and then you can get a bit of swelling and a bit things that aren't quite right because of it, and that takes time to develop. So yeah, I would say that somebody's had a head injury, absolutely no booze for 48 hours. A decent head injury, or somebody that's been diagnosed with concussion, then you should be resting, you shouldn't be going back riding, and absolutely no contact sport for 3 weeks. So it's quite, you know, it's quite a significant period of time.
Also, I'm sure you'd agree with, I'm sure you would as well, Issy, like, let's not be heroes about this. Let's just go to the flipping doctors. Let's go to the hospital. If you've banged your head off the floor, it's not you've just had a tumble. We've got to start reporting our injuries, our accidents properly, to give the medical people like Di the very best chance of helping us. Surely that's got to be a key.
No, 100%. There is on the FEI, I printed it out. So on the FEI website, there's a concussion recognition tool. I know that's not helpful for you guys now, but there is like a for the podcast, but there is a 1-page thing.
Brilliant.
Way. So if you run a yard or something, if you go onto the FEI's website and look for the concussion recognition tool 5, so it's called the CRT 5, and it's like an identification thing, and it's steps 1 to 5. So the first step is step 1, so it's all the red flags, so that if somebody has an accident in the yard, you can literally go through that and say, have they got neck pain or tenderness, double vision, weakness or tingling in arms and legs, severe or increasing headache, seizure, obviously going to call an ambulance, they've been knocked out, they're vomiting, or they're very restless or agitated. It's quite clear, call 999. And then it goes down through things that if they're not doing those things, then it goes through the next set of symptoms, and it will tell people what to do. So it's something that I think this needs, and probably through Beta, we'll see what we can do about flagging this tool up a little bit, so that yards and things can just print this out and have it in the tack room, so that if something does happen, then you can say, okay, well, grab the CRT 5, we can run through it and see if somebody's, you know, where they're needing stuff.
That's a really good idea.
But the main ones, as I said, is headache that won't go away, if you're dizzy, if you're being sick, memory loss, can't balance, all the things that Issy's talked about, really, changes in your vision. And I mean, I keep saying obviously you go to hospital. If you had a fit, clearly somebody would go then, wouldn't they? Or if they had a
I would hope so.
But I would say, you know, have somebody with you for 48 hours minimum.
Yeah.
Need to be with you, not going home on your own and having a glass of wine. It's not the way forward.
No. I mean, what have you learned from this, Issy? What have you, I'm sure it's not just about concussion, but I think when these things happen to us, we kind of take quite big life lessons away, don't we? So what have you sort of learned, either from obviously the awful time you've had with your head injury, and or obviously your horses as well, which I know I keep bringing them up, but I know I was quite emotional when I saw the time you'd had with them. And I think anyone that owns horses, it's that kind of worst nightmare, take your breath away moment. And I can't imagine that on its own, let alone when combined with this.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I learned a lot from it, to be honest. I was always the first person to be sort of like, I'm, you know, resilient, I'm tough, and I just crack on and, you know, push through it. And that was the worst thing I did, really, with the concussion. I should have listened to myself and listened to my body and everything that I was going through, and realized that I was actually really, really suffering, and that pushing through was the worst thing I could do. And you gain nothing from that. You gain absolutely nothing from that. All I gained was a long-term injury, basically. And there is no shame in putting your hand up and saying, you know, actually, I need to go see someone, I need help, and I don't think I'm right. And I just wish I'd realised that much sooner. Yeah, especially for the injury. And then, gosh, with the horses, I mean, that was that was probably the hardest thing I've ever been through. That was awful. I'll sort of explain a bit more because I've mentioned it briefly, but in January, both my horses broke out of their field in the early hours of the morning and got onto a dual carriageway near the yard and were hit by a car. Both of them were hit by a car. And thankfully the driver was all right. Thankfully both horses were all right. But they both sustained pretty significant injuries. Ben ripped his, just above his left hind, he'd had a huge gash which required stitches, and he ripped his lip open as well, so that required stitches. And then Dylan had a major open wound over his right stifle, and also sustained a fracture to his tibia as well. And with horses and tibia fractures, it's really important to keep them immobile, because if it turns into a break, it's catastrophic. There's nothing you can do. So we basically loaded him on the lorry to Liphook Equine Hospital, which is near me, and we took him there. They x-rayed him and said there was definitely a fracture, and he was there for nearly a month on cross ties to just keep him completely immobile. And then he came home and did another 9 weeks box rest with me, where it was really strict, wasn't allowed out the box. And then we've gradually sort of built him up into hand walking, and he's back in ridden work, literally just hacking straight lines, keeping it really simple. But it was it was a very awful time, and I try not to get too emotional about it, because it was difficult.
You're allowed to get emotional. I feel like I'm about to cry, and it didn't happen to you. I can see Di's like,
I'll never forget that phone call. I really won't. And just my stomach dropped. And I think the hardest part actually was when we got to Liphook, and because of COVID we weren't allowed in, and we waited in the horse box for about an hour, and we had no idea what the outcome was going to be. And I just sat there, and I don't even think, you don't really think much, because what can you think at a time like that? You just kind of hope. But we were so unbelievably lucky that they both pulled through, and that they both could have died, and they're alive and they're healthy and they're happy. And Ben is back eventing. He recovered really, really well, and he is his usual jolly, happy self. And Dylan is doing really well too. And I'm just, so relieved. And, you know, it was at a time like that where I realised how much I genuinely love them to death, and would do anything for them. And sometimes I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but it really did make me realise how much I love them and how much they mean to me.
Yeah. I think you're a superhero anyway. I mean, I thought the way you dealt with what happened to the horses was incredible, let alone with all of everything else that's been going on as well. I mean,
yeah, it's honestly, it's immense. I don't know how you did it, but the only thing I would say is, like, don't blame yourself about not going earlier about your injury. You know, it may not have had any, effect on the course of how long it will take you to get better. You know, because if things had been even worse, then you would have gone. But sometimes when people don't go, then they get into a bit of a cycle of, oh, well, if I had only done this, like no one can turn clocks back. And nothing's been catastrophic from obviously the delay, and it's just about constantly looking forward now and getting on with that rehab. We can see from this that you're incredibly motivated, and I suspect strongly that you will rehab very well and compensate if you need to for anything that you can't. So, you know, just I know Rhea will say the same, we're here to support you in any way we can anyway. So just keep going. You're doing really well, really, really well.
Thank you, Di. And actually, I think that's a good point you just made there, is that don't sort of blame yourself for what you didn't do, because actually there's no point dwelling on the past, and you're right.
And why would you know? Like, if you had those symptoms anyway, like genuinely, why would you know?
Yeah,
you wouldn't know. Like, it's all very well and good when you've got we call it the retrospectoscope in medicine, when you've got the little, like, I think it's like a telescope that means you can see back in time. Like, when you know the outcome, it's really, when you've got the information, it's really easy, isn't it? And it's really easy to like, oh God, I've just done this, you just can't change anything. It's just total waste of energy. You've got two amazing horses, you're riding really well. You know, you've been given another chance with the boys. Just crack on and just do your rehab fastidiously, and you will get better, 100%.
Is there anything else, Issy, that you would like to talk about, share, whatever today?
I think one thing I'd really love to say actually is, I know, Rhea, you talk a lot about how people really criticize social media sometimes and say it can be this really negative space and you can compare yourself to other people. But I tell you, after that accident, the hundreds of messages I had and still have was unbelievable. And I really hesitated actually about posting about it at first because it was so traumatic. And I didn't really want to relive it. But I share everything on my account, and I knew people would realize eventually that something was up. So I posted about it, and just the response was unbelievable. I couldn't keep up. And it really made me realize how incredible social media is, because some of the people I didn't even know, and some of them I know via social media, but I don't know them in person. But it was just the most amazing amount of support. And I remember when I posted once on my stories about Dylan being able to come back into ridden work, and I was quite emotional, I was quite teary, and so many people were messaging me saying this made me want to cry as well.
I remember that post. I was quite emotional about that, because I think with social, you know, we follow that journey, and I think we can all put ourselves in your position just for a split second and think, oh my, can you even imagine the horror? And seeing a positive outcome from something that sounded so bleak, I think, I think you're incredible.
Yeah, I think it was my worst nightmare. It was everyone's worst nightmare, and I really drew off a lot of that support over the coming weeks, because it was really tough. It was really, really tough, and just to have so many people behind me checking in on me, it meant the world. It really did.
Oh, good old social media.
I know, it's a really wonderful space sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think it is.
Yeah,
it is. Like, and I think you just have to, you know, there's a little bit of rough with the smooth, isn't there? But I think it you know, I think it is. And I just, you know, you just got to block and mute if you need to. And apart from that, there are some wonderful people that are using social media, and as you say, that can support you every step of the way. So yeah, I'm with you, Issy.
So is there anything else you would like to share before I let you carry on with your day?
I just think if your gut feeling tells you, see, I'm quite a strong believer in spider sense. And if your gut feeling is telling you that something is wrong, you are kind of inbuilt with the protective systems. If something is telling you something is wrong, come and see us. If you're drunk as a skunk and being an idiot, yes, we're not going to be very happy about it. Try and go to the appropriate place. So if it's appropriate to go to your GP, go to your GP. Or if not, come and see us, because we would much rather see people and reassure them than see them later on and maybe be giving catastrophic news to their family. So come and see us if you need to. It is safe to come and see us. And yeah, look after your heads because they're very precious. Wear your hats, wear your hats, wear your hats.
Well,
If you hadn't have been wearing your hat, you probably wouldn't be sat there. That's one thing we haven't said.
no.
You probably would not be sat there.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just emphasize the trust your gut thing as well, because I think I know I knew for a long time that something wasn't right, but I just didn't really feel that it was wrong enough to go and see anyone. And that was really silly because nothing's too small, you know, and actually if I'd seen someone sooner it would have been fixed much quicker. So yeah, trust your gut, it's really powerful.
Yeah, well, keep us updated in how you're getting on though.
Yeah, I will definitely. It's been a really interesting journey, and I've actually quite enjoyed learning about it all, because I think knowledge is power, and the more you know, the better you're equipped to deal with these things. So yeah, I talk to everyone about it as well. I'm like,
Brilliant, because it's not something that I've heard about before. I've heard about concussion, but I haven't heard about this before, and I think it's great to be able to share it. And obviously that you put it also, you know, you're very eloquent, you explain it so well, you talk about it so well that, you know, I'm sure you spreading the message and people like Di spreading the message as well, it's going to make a real difference to people who may be feeling like this. There might be someone listening now who's thinking, hang on a minute, that sounds a lot like me. I should take this a step further. And you know, I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think it's about having a bit more understanding and taking a bit more ownership for ourselves. And I think if we do that, then to kind of miss things and look after ourselves so we can look after our beautiful horses.
Yeah, exactly. We do all the care for our horses, so why not for ourselves?
Exactly.
Di, can you remind us all the places where people can find you online if they want to see all sorts of pictures that make your stomach churn and learn lots of things?
So I'm on Instagram and Facebook as All the King's Horses with lots of weird dashes, and then you can get hold of me through Beta, and I do have an email, cmo@beta.org.uk.
It's not a bad email, is it?
No.
And Issy, of course, tell us all the places where we can find you online.
Yep, so I'm on Instagram at Zigzag Eventing, and also on Facebook at Zigzag Eventing, although definitely more active on Instagram.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, ladies. That's been a brilliant episode.
Thank you, Ria.
Thanks, Mel.